"I only speak to real officers," the German general said, his voice firm, carrying the weight of years in command. West Texas, September 1944. The sun hung low, burning the horizon into copper and shadow, dust drifting over the sandy ground. The POW compound stretched out beneath a sky impossibly wide, barbed wire tracing geometric lines around rows of wooden barracks. General Klaus Adler stepped down from the transport truck, his boots crunching against the red dirt, legs stiff from hours of sitting, shoulders squared, chin raised. He scanned the camp, eyes narrowing at the figures in uniform moving along the perimeter. 8 women and 20 men had been unloaded before him, each orderly, each measured, but he paid them little mind. His focus was singular, a demand of propriety and recognition. Captain Robert Hayes watched from the raised platform near the corral, arms folded, posture relaxed yet commanding, the light catching the edge of his dark uniform. The way he stood making the POWs feel the weight of both presence and discipline. Hayes had been supervising the camp for months, seen thousands of prisoners come and go, and yet something in the arrival of Adler called for more than routine protocol. The general's eyes met Hayes's, sizing him up, calculating the challenge before him. The air was still, the wind carrying the scent of dust and sun-baked timber. Hayes took a single measured step forward, letting the movement carry its own authority, letting the silence speak before words ever left his mouth. Adler's jaw tightened. He gestured with a hand, sharp, commanding attention. "I demand to speak only to real officers." Hayes tilted his head slightly, a faint crease in his brow, but his lips remained set. He reached into the pocket of his uniform and adjusted a strap on his belt, a small gesture that belied the calm certainty of his control. He stepped closer, not hurried, not aggressive, simply present. The shadow of his figure stretched across the ground toward Adler, long and unwavering. The general swallowed, his confidence meeting the unexpected clarity of Hayes's composure. The heat pressed down on them both, a weight that made every breath deliberate. Dust motes danced in the sunlight, swirling in a quiet rhythm around the 2 men. Every detail, the creak of leather boots on the wood platform, the flutter of a loose piece of paper caught in the wind, the distant clang of tools from the compound, built the tension. Adler shifted, taking in the sight of Hayes standing alone, every inch of him the definition of command without raising his voice, the authority carried not by volume but by presence. For a heartbeat, the world narrowed to that space between them, the sun glaring, the earth warm beneath boots, a pause that felt suspended, electric. Then Hayes spoke, voice even, measured, almost conversational. "I am the officer in charge here." The words landed with gravity, not shouted, not needing to be, their weight enough to tilt the balance of expectation. Adler's eyes flickered, a brief flash of surprise, disbelief mingling with reluctant respect. He had expected defiance to be met with force, a demonstration of superiority, and yet here it was, calm certainty. The camp seemed to hold its breath, the distant shuffle of guards, and the murmur of men fading into near silence. Dust drifted, a solitary tumbleweed skimming across the open yard, a slow, rolling reminder of the quiet persistence of the landscape around them. Adler's hands flexed at his sides, a subtle tension that spoke of restrained authority meeting unexpected parity. Hayes's gaze held, unblinking, steady, signaling that the rules of engagement were not bent, that professionalism and humanity could coexist. Adler inhaled slowly, the words echoing in his mind, the realization sinking in that the measure of a real officer was not defined by appearance or preconceived notions, but by conduct, poise, and respect earned through deliberate action. In that quiet, under the harsh West Texas sun, the balance shifted imperceptibly. What had been challenge and arrogance gave way to contemplation, a reevaluation of assumptions, a subtle nod to the authority that had been quietly asserted. The wind stirred again, lifting the edges of the general's uniform, brushing across the platform where Hayes remained unmoving. Time itself seemed to expand, each second drawn out, allowing the import of the moment to settle, to imprint, to linger. The general exhaled, a soft, measured breath, acknowledging the unspoken hierarchy, the invisible line of command drawn not by rank alone, but by the gravity of presence and calm decisiveness. The sun had shifted higher in the sky, its warmth pressing down on the compound with a steady insistence, painting the wooden barracks and dust-laden ground in a golden haze. Captain Robert Hayes remained still, observing as General Klaus. Adler adjusted his uniform, the edges of the jacket brushing against the dry dirt beneath his polished boots. The general's eyes moved rapidly, noting the orderly rows of buildings, the guards walking along the perimeter with precise, deliberate steps, and the muted chatter of other prisoners being processed in the distance. Every detail seemed to feed his sense of authority, yet each observation was quietly challenged by the composed presence of Hayes. The air was dry, carrying the faint scent of sun-baked timber and the distant trace of sagebrush, a quiet reminder of the vast landscape beyond the compound. Adler's hands flexed at his sides, fingers brushing the seams of his gloves, a ritualistic adjustment to maintain the illusion of control. Hayes's gaze held steady, unyielding, the slight tilt of his head and the measured cadence of his breathing a subtle assertion of discipline. The general cleared his throat, his voice breaking the stillness, though it carried a restrained sharpness rather than aggression. "You are responsible for this facility?" he asked, eyes narrowing. Hayes nodded, a single deliberate motion, and for a moment, the world seemed to pause. The compound, the guards, the line of prisoners, all faded into the periphery as the tension between the two men crystallized into an almost tangible weight. Adler stepped forward, boots stirring small clouds of dust, posture rigid, chin lifted. He studied Hayes as though searching for a weakness, an imperfection, anything that could justify the stance he had assumed, a stance forged over years of command and unquestioned respect in his homeland. Hayes did not flinch, did not offer any sign of yielding. He adjusted the strap of his belt, the movement minimal yet deliberate, a silent confirmation that authority was not claimed through loudness but through presence. The sun shifted, casting long shadows across the yard, and dust motes drifted lazily in the light, spinning in slow, silent patterns around the two figures. Adler exhaled, a controlled movement that betrayed a flicker of uncertainty, the first crack in his veneer of absolute confidence. Hayes's posture remained unchanging, but his eyes, dark and measured, tracked every subtle motion of the general, noting the slightest shift in weight, the micro-expressions that revealed the mind behind the stoic face. The wind moved across the compound, lifting small particles of dirt and straw, brushing against their boots, carrying with it the faint metallic tang of equipment, the wooden tang of barracks, and the faint scent of leather from belts and satchels. Adler's gaze swept over the scene once more, taking in the orderly movement of guards, the meticulous arrangement of supplies, the quiet efficiency of a system that operated without chaos yet without rigidity. Hayes's hand rested briefly on the side of his holster, not a gesture of threat, but a signal of readiness, calm and assured, a subtle affirmation that control could exist without harshness. A line of prisoners moved in the background, their steps measured, carrying the weight of circumstance, yet unaware of the intricate exchange unfolding at the center of the yard. Adler's posture softened fractionally, the tension in his shoulders easing as comprehension slowly dawned, the realization settling that command could be exercised with authority, precision, and yet tempered with humanity. The heat of the sun, the dust in the air, the distant sounds of shovels and muted voices all coalesced into a single moment of suspended clarity, each element reinforcing the gravity of the interaction. Adler inhaled, the movement deliberate, the air dry against his lungs, and he took a careful step back, eyes meeting Hayes's with a mixture of lingering pride and newfound respect. Hayes allowed a faint nod, acknowledging the shift, the recognition of authority acknowledged not through force or intimidation, but through presence, poise, and an unwavering commitment to fairness. The subtle interplay of shadow and light, the measured breaths, the distant shuffle of men, and the occasional metallic clink of equipment all combined into a scene of quiet assertion, the tension slowly diffusing into an understanding that extended beyond words. In that expanse of West Texas, under a sun both harsh and illuminating, the general recognized a principle that transcended protocol, a lesson in leadership and respect observed, absorbed, and quietly acknowledged. leaving an impression that would endure long after the sun had passed its zenith. The afternoon sun continued its steady climb, casting a warm, golden light across the camp yard, illuminating the worn wooden surfaces and the neat rows of barracks in sharp contrast against the pale dust of the open yard. Captain Robert Hayes moved deliberately, his steps measured, boots pressing lightly into the sun-warmed dirt, the rhythm of his movements steady and purposeful. General Klaus Adler remained rooted in place for a moment longer, eyes following every motion of Hayes, absorbing the subtle assertion of authority that needed no words. A gentle breeze stirred, lifting dust into the air in thin, lazy spirals that caught the light, drifting across the compound with a slow, almost hypnotic cadence. The distant hum of activity, the shuffle of other prisoners performing assigned tasks, the occasional murmur of conversation, the soft clatter of tools being carried along wooden walkways, formed a muted backdrop, accentuating the tense focus of the two men in the central yard. Adler exhaled, a controlled breath that seemed to release a fraction of the rigidity in his posture, though the confidence in his stance remained measured and precise. Hayes did not speak immediately, allowing the silence to stretch, to create space in which the general could reflect, to let the presence of composed authority settle in with a weight that was tangible without being oppressive. Each detail was noted. The glint of sunlight along the edge of Hayes's shoulder strap, the subtle sway of a piece of paper pinned under the wind, the way shadows shifted across the uneven ground, stretching and contracting with the movement of the sun. Adler's mind, trained to command, now confronted an unfamiliar equation, a recognition that authority could exist without the need for assertion or bluster, that respect could be established through quiet control and an unflinching presence. He stepped forward slowly, adjusting the gloves on his hands, the gesture meticulous, habitual, but now tempered by the awareness of the deliberate poise exhibited by Hayes. The captain's eyes remained fixed, observing, acknowledging nothing overtly, yet radiating a steady confidence that communicated without sound, without motion beyond the slight, deliberate shifts of weight and stance. Dust motes continued to drift lazily, the heat making the air shimmer in subtle waves, carrying with it the dry, faint scent of sun-baked timber and distant sage. The surrounding barracks, the low fences, the distant figures performing routine duties, all became part of a tableau that framed the interaction in a quiet, cinematic tension. Adler's gaze swept across the compound again, noting the order, the quiet efficiency, the way that discipline coexisted with calm oversight, and he began to recalibrate his understanding of what constituted command, of how authority could be asserted and recognized without aggression. Hayes finally took a small step, just enough to close some of the space between them, yet his movement was deliberate, measured, a signal that authority was not a matter of size or previous rank, but of presence and intent. The general's shoulders flexed slightly, an almost imperceptible shift, the recognition dawning that the moment called for acceptance rather than confrontation. The wind picked up, teasing the edges of uniforms, rustling small objects left on wooden walkways, adding a sensory texture to the encounter. Adler adjusted his stance once more, his eyes holding a mixture of reluctant acknowledgement and reflective thought. Hayes nodded slightly, a gesture so minimal it might have been overlooked, yet it conveyed acknowledgement, patience, and the subtle reinforcement of the principle that respect and authority could be maintained without harshness. The compound held its quiet rhythm, prisoners and guards moving through their routines, oblivious to the nuanced interplay of presence and perception occurring at the center of the yard. Adler inhaled slowly, letting the dry, warm air fill his lungs, and he allowed himself a fraction of acknowledgement, a private concession that the balance of authority had shifted not through intimidation, but through measured poise, calm observance, and a quiet insistence on fairness. The moment lingered, stretching as the sun traced its arc across the sky, shadows deepening and lengthening, dust continuing to drift, and a subtle understanding forming between the two men that transcended spoken language, a recognition that authority could command without spectacle, that composure could yield recognition, and that presence alone, measured and unwavering, could redefine expectation within the vast expanse of the camp. The late afternoon sun dipped lower, elongating the shadows across the compound and casting a warm, amber glow that softened the sharp angles of the wooden barracks and the taut lines of barbed wire. Captain Robert Hayes stepped aside slightly, allowing General Klaus Adler a broader view of the yard, his movements precise, deliberate, yet entirely unhurried. The general's gaze swept over the expanse, noting the neat arrangement of supplies, the disciplined order of the guards, the faint ripple of activity among prisoners performing assigned tasks. The dust hung in the air like a slow, golden haze, catching the sunlight in motes that drifted lazily across the open space. Adler adjusted his stance, hands resting lightly on his belt, fingers tracing the edges of leather gloves as if to ground himself. Hayes's eyes remained fixed, observing every nuance of the general's posture, the subtle shifts in weight, the almost imperceptible flex of muscles, each movement a silent conversation. The wind stirred, carrying the scent of dry earth and distant timber, rustling a loose sheet of paper on the platform and lifting the edges of Hayes's uniform. Adler inhaled, deliberate and controlled, the dry air brushing against his lungs as he considered the quiet authority that Hayes embodied. He had expected a challenge, a demonstration of superiority, yet found himself confronted with a presence that commanded attention without force. Hayes took a measured step forward, boots sinking slightly into the sun-warmed dirt, the motion deliberate, unhurried, radiating control. The subtle shift caused Adler to tighten the grip on his gloves, the contrast between motion and stillness drawing his focus. The compound itself seemed to breathe around them, the soft clatter of equipment, the shuffle of feet on wooden planks, the distant murmur of conversation forming a backdrop that highlighted the tension in their encounter. Adler's eyes flicked toward the small group of prisoners observing from a distance, their expressions uncertain, then back to Hayes, noting the calm, unwavering gaze that seemed to anchor the space between them. The sun moved imperceptibly, shifting the angle of light, tracing patterns across their uniforms, the elongated shadows stretching toward the barracks and intertwining with the dust-laden ground. Hayes's hand rested lightly at his side, not a gesture of threat but of readiness, a subtle affirmation that presence alone could command recognition. Adler's jaw flexed, a micro-expression of contemplation passing across his features, the realization dawning that authority could be asserted through poise, through measured action, and through the quiet confidence of someone who understood the weight of responsibility without needing to broadcast it. He shifted his stance slightly, shoulders relaxing in acknowledgement, eyes meeting Hayes's with a mixture of curiosity, caution, and respect. The wind lifted again, brushing against the edges of their uniforms, teasing loose strands of hair, carrying with it the subtle sense of sage, sun-baked dirt, and distant timber. Adler exhaled slowly, the motion controlled, as he allowed himself to absorb the lesson embedded in the stillness and deliberate movements of Hayes. The compound, the prisoners, the guards, and the wooden structures became part of the scene, framing a moment of unspoken understanding, a tableau in which authority, respect, and human composure intersected. The sun continued its descent, casting a deeper, richer hue across the ground, emphasizing the textures of the environment, the grain of the wood, the dryness of the soil, the shimmer of dust particles in the light. Adler adjusted the positioning of his boots, aligning with the angle of sunlight, grounding himself, and in that motion acknowledging the equilibrium established through Hayes's quiet dominance. The air held a faint warmth, a lingering dryness that carried the tactile reality of the environment, the compound alive with subtle motion, yet the central exchange remained undisturbed, charged with anticipation, reflection, and recognition. Hayes shifted his weight slightly, a minimal motion that drew attention to his steady presence, reinforcing the unspoken truth that command did not require volume, that composure and clarity were sufficient to reshape perception. Adler's eyes followed each movement, and a quiet nod formed, almost imperceptible, a concession to understanding, an internal acknowledgement that the structure of authority could exist alongside respect, fairness, and unassuming confidence. The shadows lengthened further, the light mellowing, dust continuing its slow dance in the fading rays, as both men remained in this delicate balance of awareness, observing, measuring, and absorbing the lesson of calm authority, a silent dialogue of presence, poise, and recognition that extended beyond the need for words, leaving an imprint that would linger long after the sun had passed below the horizon. The sun had dipped closer to the horizon, painting the compound in hues of orange and amber, casting long, soft shadows that stretched across the dusty ground and the wooden surfaces of the barracks. Captain Robert Hayes stood tall, his posture unwavering, each breath steady, his gaze sweeping the yard with careful observation, taking in every detail of the space, every movement of the guards, and every subtle shift among the prisoners. General Klaus Adler remained a few steps away, his expression thoughtful, shoulders squared, hands adjusting the edges of his gloves as he processed the quiet authority Hayes projected. The heat of the late afternoon pressed gently on the skin, carrying the subtle aroma of sun-baked earth, dry wood, and the distant scent of sage drifting from the surrounding hills. Dust rose in lazy spirals around their boots, drifting in the golden light like small, slow-motion dancers, accentuating the measured rhythm of their standoff. Hayes shifted his weight slightly, a deliberate movement that reinforced the calm precision of his presence, an assertion of command without a word. Adler's eyes followed every nuance, noting the subtle ease with which Hayes moved, the fluidity of posture, the absence of hasty gestures or overt displays of power. A faint wind stirred, lifting stray bits of paper and the edges of jackets, whispering across the compound in soft, sibilant currents, and carrying with it the low hum of distant activity, the shuffle of feet along wooden walkways, the muted clatter of tools being carried, and the occasional murmur of voices as prisoners completed their assigned tasks. Adler exhaled slowly, the motion controlled and deliberate, a rhythm that mirrored Hayes's own measured breathing. He took a cautious step forward, boots crunching lightly on the sun-warmed dirt, and observed the captain with a renewed awareness, noting the steady assurance in every movement, the quiet command that emanated from a presence unshaken by challenge. Hayes allowed a subtle nod, a minimal gesture, almost imperceptible yet powerful in its implication, acknowledging the general's presence while maintaining the invisible boundaries of authority. Shadows continued to stretch and lengthen, painting intricate patterns across the compound, highlighting the textures of wood, dust, and stone, while the warm light deepened, creating a sense of depth and gravity that framed the exchange between the two men. Adler's hands relaxed fractionally, the tension in his posture easing as comprehension slowly solidified, the recognition dawning that true command could be expressed through poise, through measured observation, and through the quiet confidence of someone who understood the weight of responsibility and the importance of fairness. Hayes's eyes tracked the subtle reactions, the micro-expressions, the minute shifts in balance and gaze, each one reinforcing the deliberate assertion of control achieved through calm presence. Adler allowed himself a brief survey of the yard, taking in the order, the precision of movement, the quiet efficiency of the environment, and the way discipline could coexist with humanity, structure with respect. Dust motes continued to drift in lazy spirals, catching the final rays of sunlight, illuminating the space between the two men, marking a delicate boundary of recognition, authority, and understanding. The faint, distant sounds of activity, the scraping of boots, the soft thud of tools being placed, the murmur of conversation, provided an understated soundtrack to the silent dialogue unfolding, emphasizing the contrast between the stillness of intention and the ongoing rhythm of life within the compound. Adler exhaled again, deliberately, allowing the dry warmth of the air to ground him, each breath reinforcing the acknowledgement of Hayes's measured authority, the unspoken understanding that had settled between them. Without the need for argument or assertion, Hayes remained still, his gaze steady, observing the compound, the general, and the subtle unfolding of recognition, his posture and presence a study in composed authority, patience, and unspoken communication. The sun continued its slow descent, deepening the golden hue, elongating shadows further, and casting a soft, reflective light across their faces and the yard, embedding the moment into the senses with a quiet weight, a sense of equilibrium, and an understanding that the day, the light, and the space itself bore witness to the meeting of discipline, respect, and human composure. The light of the early evening filtered through the sparse clouds, softening the harsh lines of the compound and casting a gentle, warm glow that mellowed the dust-covered ground. Captain Robert Hayes adjusted the strap on his belt and allowed a slow, deliberate scan of the yard, taking in every detail: the neat rows of prisoners' quarters, the quiet movements of guards along the perimeter, and the orderly rhythm of daily routine. General Klaus Adler stood a few paces away, hands lightly resting on the sides of his uniform, shoulders squared, eyes following the precise, measured steps of Hayes with a mixture of scrutiny and cautious acknowledgement. The air held the warmth of the sun, tempered by a faint breeze that stirred loose dirt and the edges of uniforms, carrying subtle scents of timber and dry earth from the surrounding hills. Hayes took a minimal, almost imperceptible step forward, shifting his weight with quiet authority, each motion intentional, each gesture reinforcing the unspoken command he held. Adler observed, noting the fluidity, the calm precision, the absence of hasty or exaggerated movements, and felt the tension between expectation and reality unfold with each passing moment. The yard around them maintained its quiet hum of activity, the shuffle of boots on the ground, the muted clatter of equipment, the occasional soft murmur of conversation among prisoners. But these sounds faded into the periphery as the exchange of presence and authority remained the focal point. Dust motes drifted slowly through the air, illuminated by the deepening sun, moving in lazy spirals that mirrored the unspoken rhythm between the two men. Adler exhaled, slow and deliberate, allowing the warmth of the air and the subtle motion of the wind to ground his thoughts, to weigh each observation and reaction against the composed steadiness of Hayes. The general adjusted his stance, shifting his weight slightly to balance the sensation of observation and the underlying recognition that true authority could manifest through calm presence rather than assertive display. Hayes's gaze followed Adler's micro-movements, the tilt of the head, the flexing of fingers, the subtle adjustment of gloves, and registered each one with quiet acknowledgement, reinforcing the unspoken structure of command present in the space between them. The sun continued its descent, casting longer shadows, the light painting textures across the ground, the barracks, and the figures, highlighting the deliberate cadence of each step and the faint ripple of cloth against uniform. Adler's eyes swept across the compound again, taking in the ordered environment, the quiet efficiency, and the coexistence of structure and human presence, gradually internalizing the lesson embedded in Hayes's measured composure. A soft breeze lifted stray dust and stirred the edges of documents and clothing, accentuating the stillness and intention of Hayes's movements, the contrast between still observation and deliberate action. Adler shifted his stance once more, shoulders easing, eyes meeting Hayes's with a mixture of reflection and acknowledgement, understanding that the weight of command rested as much in measured presence and fairness as in rank or reputation. Hayes allowed the moment to linger, his posture unwavering, gaze steady, presence calm, yet commanding, creating a space in which Adler could absorb, comprehend, and respect the principles silently conveyed. The compound, the faint hum of activity, the shifting light, and the drifting dust coalesced around the two men, marking a quiet equilibrium where authority, recognition, and human composure intersected, leaving a lasting impression of the power inherent in presence, poise, and deliberate, patient command. The light shifted toward the horizon, bathing the compound in a soft, golden glow that softened the harsh textures of the wooden barracks and the dry, dusty earth. Captain Robert Hayes moved slowly along the perimeter, his steps deliberate and measured, each footfall precise, yet silent against the sun-warmed ground. General Klaus Adler followed, maintaining a careful distance, his eyes scanning the compound with a mix of lingering scrutiny and quiet acknowledgement, the tension in his shoulders easing imperceptibly. The air held the warm, dry scent of sun-baked timber and sagebrush, mingling with the faint aroma of the dust rising from the ground, swirling in lazy, imperceptible eddies that caught the fading light. Hayes paused briefly, allowing a moment of stillness to settle over the yard, and Adler adjusted the positioning of his gloves, the movement habitual, yet now tinged with contemplation, as he observed the composed authority radiating from Hayes. The compound remained active but subdued. Prisoners moved with measured steps through the yard, the shuffle of boots and soft clatter of equipment providing a gentle, ambient rhythm that underscored the central exchange. A breeze stirred, lifting small motes of dust and the edges of papers scattered across the wooden platforms, moving through the scene in a slow, deliberate dance that mirrored the unspoken cadence between the two men. Adler inhaled, filling his lungs with the dry, warm air, and allowed himself to focus on the subtle details of Hayes's presence. The steady gaze, the controlled movements, the calm assertion of authority that needed no demonstration of force. Hayes shifted his weight slightly, a minimal, deliberate motion that reinforced his presence without breaking the stillness. The rhythm of action balanced perfectly against the surrounding quiet. The sun dipped lower, casting elongated shadows that stretched across the compound, highlighting the textures of the earth, the wood, and the figures of both men, emphasizing the unspoken dialogue of poise, respect, and acknowledgement. Adler's eyes followed each movement, noting the careful precision, the quiet confidence, the understated clarity of purpose, and he allowed a subtle shift in his stance, a small acknowledgement of the authority and equilibrium Hayes maintained. The distant hum of activity, the soft scrape of boots, the low murmur of voices, the faint clink of equipment, provided context without intrusion, a backdrop that accentuated the concentrated tension and understanding between the two men. Dust motes continued their slow drift, catching the final rays of sunlight, creating a delicate, almost tangible curtain through which the interaction unfolded, each particle of dust highlighting the space and distance, the silent dialogue of awareness and recognition. Adler adjusted his posture again, shoulders relaxing further, gaze holding Hayes's with quiet attention, acknowledging the principle that leadership could be conveyed with measured presence, calm observation, and thoughtful action rather than through overt display or declaration. Hayes allowed the moment to linger, his body composed, gaze steady, presence unwavering, reinforcing the silent but undeniable structure of command that now existed between them. The shadows deepened, the light mellowed into a warm amber that settled over the compound, casting long lines across the yard, the wooden walkways, and the figures themselves, emphasizing the subtle, deliberate interplay of authority, recognition, and human composure. Adler exhaled slowly, the motion measured, the warmth of the air grounding him, and he allowed the stillness, the quiet rhythm of Hayes's presence, and the soft, golden light to impress upon him the unspoken understanding of respect, order, and composure, leaving a lasting awareness of the quiet power embedded in patience, poise, and deliberate action. The sky had deepened to a rich, warm orange as the sun settled closer to the horizon, casting long, soft shadows across the compound and lending a gentle glow to the dust-laden ground. Captain Robert Hayes remained steady, his posture tall and composed, each breath deliberate as he surveyed the yard with meticulous attention, noting the movements of guards, the placement of supplies, and the measured rhythm of prisoners completing their duties. General Klaus Adler mirrored his observation, standing a few paces behind, eyes sweeping the space with a mixture of curiosity, cautious reflection, and quiet acknowledgement. The dry air carried the faint scent of sun-baked timber and sagebrush, blending with the subtle warmth radiating from the earth, and a light breeze stirred, lifting fine motes of dust that caught the sun's fading rays in slow, lazy spirals. Hayes took a deliberate step forward, boots pressing into the soft dirt, the motion minimal yet commanding, a silent reinforcement of the calm authority he projected. Adler's eyes followed each motion, noting the precision, the lack of haste, and the way every gesture was measured and purposeful, revealing confidence without ostentation. The compound's subtle sounds, the shuffle of boots on wooden walkways, the muted hum of conversation, the soft clatter of equipment, provided an understated rhythm that contrasted with the focused intensity between the two men. Adler exhaled slowly, a deliberate and controlled motion, allowing the warm, dry air to ground him as he absorbed the unspoken communication, the demonstration that command could be established through presence and careful attention rather than by volume or force. Hayes allowed a small, almost imperceptible nod, a gesture that acknowledged Adler's observation while reinforcing the unspoken hierarchy and mutual respect developing between them. Dust continued to drift in thin, golden spirals, swirling gently around their boots and across the yard, catching the last light of the sun and marking the passage of time with quiet grace. Adler shifted his stance slightly, shoulders relaxing fractionally, as comprehension settled in, the recognition dawning that authority could be exercised with calm precision, fairness, and human consideration. The compound stretched beyond them, orderly and composed, the wooden barracks, fences, and open spaces forming a backdrop that emphasized the subtle, deliberate dynamics unfolding at its center. Hayes's gaze remained unwavering, following the subtle cues in Adler's posture, noting the minute shifts of weight, the careful positioning of hands and shoulders, and the restrained tension that reflected thought and acknowledgement. The wind stirred again, teasing the edges of clothing and loose papers, carrying the faint sounds and scents of the surroundings, and reinforcing the stillness of the central exchange. Adler inhaled slowly, the warmth of the air and the calm rhythm of the yard grounding him, each breath a measured acknowledgement of the balance of authority, poise, and composure now present. The sun sank further, deepening the colors, elongating shadows across the compound, highlighting textures of the earth, wood, and uniforms, casting a cinematic quality over the scene. Adler's eyes met Hayes's with a subtle nod, a quiet concession to understanding, a recognition that command could exist without harshness, that authority was validated through deliberate presence, measured observation, and patient composure. Hayes allowed the stillness to persist, letting the environment, the shifting light, the drifting dust, the muted background activity, frame the moment, reinforcing the lesson of calm, patient, and deliberate leadership, leaving a lasting impression of respect, recognition, and the quiet power inherent in human composure and measured authority. The evening sun had lowered further, casting deep, rich hues of amber and gold across the compound, the long shadows stretching over the dusty ground and wooden barracks in intricate patterns that shifted with the gentle breeze. Captain Robert Hayes remained composed, standing tall with a steady, measured gaze that swept over the entire yard, noting the movements of guards and prisoners alike, observing the precise rhythm of the daily routines unfolding around him. General Klaus Adler lingered a few paces behind, his posture upright, shoulders squared, eyes following Hayes with a blend of curiosity, contemplation, and the quiet acknowledgement of the authority quietly asserted through presence and deliberate action. The air was dry, carrying the subtle, sun-warmed scent of timber and earth, mingled faintly with the aroma of sage drifting from the distant hills. Dust motes floated lazily through the light, catching the fading sun in slow spirals that accentuated the still, focused tension between the two men. Hayes shifted his weight slightly, a deliberate motion, and Adler noted the precision and calmness of every step, the confidence in motion without the need for force or loud assertion. The compound was alive with subdued activity, prisoners moving with measured steps, tools clattering softly, murmurs carried across the yard, yet all these sounds formed a gentle backdrop to the concentrated interaction unfolding at its center. Adler exhaled slowly, controlled, allowing the warmth and dryness of the air to ground him, reinforcing the awareness of the deliberate composure Hayes exhibited and the principle that authority could be expressed without harshness or spectacle. Hayes tilted his head subtly, a minimal acknowledgement of the general's scrutiny, reinforcing the silent dialogue of mutual recognition, respect, and the reinforcement of orderly command. Dust continued to drift, rising from the ground with each shift of the breeze, marking the passage of time in slow, deliberate arcs, catching the last light of day and framing the two men in a cinematic tableau of observation and understanding. Adler's shoulders relaxed fractionally as comprehension deepened, the recognition dawning that true leadership encompassed calm, deliberate presence, patient observation, and measured action. That respect was earned not by assertion alone, but through poise, clarity, and thoughtful engagement. Hayes's eyes remained fixed, attentive to micro-movements, subtle shifts in balance, and the small, intentional gestures that conveyed authority without aggression. The soft wind stirred edges of clothing and papers, brushing against boots and uniforms, emphasizing the stillness and deliberate pacing of the encounter. Adler adjusted his stance, hands brushing along seams of his uniform, acknowledging the subtle power of patience, composure, and fairness as Hayes continued his measured survey of the compound. The sun lowered further, the shadows deepening, stretching over the yard and buildings, the light mellowing into a rich, warm amber, accentuating textures of the earth, wood, and fabric, and drawing into focus the silent interplay of authority, recognition, and human composure. Adler inhaled slowly, the dry warmth filling his lungs, his eyes meeting Hayes's in quiet reflection, a subtle nod forming, the acknowledgement of the equilibrium, the respect, and the quiet assertion of command through calm presence. The compound, alive with gentle, purposeful motion, became a backdrop to the measured, deliberate, and unspoken exchange, where patience, observation, and composure spoke louder than words. Dust motes continued their slow, lazy drift through the golden light, marking the stillness, the rhythm, and the silent communication that had settled between Hayes and Adler, leaving a lasting impression of calm authority, human respect, and the quiet power inherent in measured, deliberate presence as the day slowly faded toward night. The sky had turned a deep, burnished orange, the last rays of sunlight filtering through a thin veil of clouds and casting a warm glow across the compound. Captain Robert Hayes walked slowly along the edge of the yard, each step measured, boots pressing into the soft, dusty ground, eyes sweeping the space with careful, deliberate attention. General Klaus Adler followed a few paces behind, his posture upright, shoulders squared, gaze tracing Hayes's movements with a mixture of observation and quiet acknowledgement. The air carried the subtle warmth of the late afternoon, tinged with the dry scent of earth and sage, and a gentle breeze stirred, lifting dust motes into lazy spirals that caught the light as they drifted across the yard. Hayes paused for a moment, letting the stillness settle around them, a quiet gravity that emphasized the subtle authority he maintained without a word. Adler adjusted his gloves, the movement habitual yet deliberate, a reflection of both his training and his growing awareness of the unspoken dynamic between them. The compound remained active but subdued. Prisoners moved along measured paths, carrying out their assignments with disciplined precision, their soft footfalls and the faint clatter of tools forming a gentle backdrop to the focused interaction at the center of the yard. Dust motes continued their slow dance in the air, catching the fading sunlight in a golden haze that emphasized the stillness, the tension, and the careful balance of observation and presence between the two men. Adler inhaled slowly, the motion controlled, letting the warmth and dryness of the air anchor him, heightening his awareness of the subtle lessons conveyed through Hayes's calm, deliberate movements. Hayes shifted his weight slightly, a minimal motion, each step and adjustment reinforcing the silent assertion of authority, a presence grounded not in words but in measured observation and patience. Adler noted every micro-movement, the tilt of the head, the flexing of fingers, the way Hayes's uniform shifted with slight motion, and allowed the quiet intensity of these details to settle into his understanding of composure and leadership. The shadows lengthened as the sun sank lower, stretching across the barracks, fences, and open yard, emphasizing the texture of the ground, the wood, and the uniforms, creating a tableau in which authority and respect were conveyed silently, through presence alone. Adler's shoulders eased slightly, a subtle acknowledgement of the command present in Hayes's calm, deliberate stance, and his eyes held a quiet reflection of recognition, a growing understanding of the principles at work. The soft wind moved through the compound again, teasing the edges of clothing and papers, carrying the faint, ambient sounds of activity. Boots scraping, murmured instructions, tools shifting, yet none of it disrupted the interaction unfolding between the two men. Adler inhaled once more, steady and measured, absorbing the warmth, the light, the quiet rhythm of the yard, and the unspoken communication that had formed, reinforcing his recognition that authority could coexist with patience, fairness, and observation. Hayes remained still, gaze unwavering, posture firm yet relaxed, letting the scene unfold naturally around them. the golden light and drifting dust providing context and framing the silent exchange of understanding. Adler allowed a subtle nod, barely perceptible, a concession to the equilibrium, to the lesson embedded in the careful, composed actions of Hayes. The compound, alive with subdued motion, became a backdrop to the intricate, quiet dialogue, the interplay of observation, recognition, and presence, marking a moment in which patience, composure, and deliberate leadership carried weight far beyond spoken words, leaving a lasting impression of respect and the silent power of measured, human authority as the day transitioned gently into the soft hues of dusk. The sun had almost disappeared behind the distant hills, leaving the compound bathed in a soft, muted glow that lent a quiet intimacy to the wide, open space. Captain Robert Hayes remained in place, standing tall and composed, eyes sweeping the yard with deliberate care, noting every detail of the environment. The arrangement of barracks, the methodical movement of prisoners along defined paths, the subtle cues of the guards as they carried out their duties. General Klaus Adler lingered a few paces behind, shoulders squared, hands resting lightly at his sides, eyes following Hayes's movements with careful observation and growing acknowledgement of the subtle authority being projected without a word. The air had cooled slightly, carrying the faint scent of dry earth and sage from the surrounding hills, and a gentle breeze lifted dust motes into slow, lazy spirals that drifted through the golden remnants of daylight. Hayes shifted his weight slightly, a minimal motion that drew attention without breaking the stillness, reinforcing the calm presence he maintained. Adler's gaze followed, noting the precision, the patience, and the deliberate ease in every gesture, the way authority could be asserted without volume or haste. The yard remained active in a subdued rhythm, the soft scrape of boots on wood and earth, the distant murmur of voices, the faint clatter of tools forming a gentle backdrop to the silent, concentrated interaction between the two men. Adler exhaled, slow and measured, allowing the warmth of the air and the calm of the environment to ground him, each breath reinforcing the growing understanding that leadership could exist through composed presence, observation, and patience. Hayes adjusted slightly, his eyes sweeping over the compound, taking in the order and efficiency, his posture radiating quiet command and deliberate control, the subtle movements communicating authority without demonstration. Dust continued to drift in the last light, catching the glow and accentuating the space between the two men, framing the silent dialogue of respect, observation, and acknowledgement. Adler shifted his stance, shoulders easing as comprehension deepened, the realization dawning that authority could coexist with fairness, clarity, and patient composure. The shadows lengthened, stretching across the yard and barracks, emphasizing the contours and textures of the ground and structures, highlighting the careful, deliberate interaction unfolding in the center of the compound. Hayes remained still, gaze steady, posture unyielding yet relaxed, allowing the moment to stretch and the scene to establish itself as a tableau of measured authority, recognition, and human composure. Adler's eyes met Hayes's in quiet reflection, a subtle nod forming, acknowledging the balance, the understanding, and the quiet power of presence and deliberate action. The compound, with its low hum of activity, drifting dust, and soft ambient sounds, framed the moment, reinforcing the principles of patient leadership, deliberate observation, and composed interaction. The remaining light softened further, casting the yard in warm, muted amber, and in that gentle glow, the lesson of calm authority, mutual respect, and the enduring strength of measured composure left an indelible impression on the general, marking a moment where understanding and recognition transcended words, and presence alone defined the hierarchy and human dignity in the compound. Twilight had settled fully over the compound, casting a soft indigo hue across the wooden barracks and the dusty earth, the shadows stretching long and blending gently with the fading light. Captain Robert Hayes remained in place, posture tall and assured, each breath measured, eyes scanning the yard with a deliberate focus that noted every subtle movement, the precise step of a guard, the gentle sway of a piece of canvas pinned to a pole, the soft shuffle of prisoners finishing their duties. General Klaus Adler stood nearby, a few paces behind, shoulders relaxed yet squared, eyes following Hayes with attentive curiosity and the quiet acknowledgement of the authority quietly asserted through calm presence. The air had cooled slightly, carrying the dry scent of earth and sage, and a faint breeze stirred, lifting dust motes in slow, lazy spirals that caught the last hints of light, tracing delicate patterns in the air around them. Hayes shifted his weight with minimal movement, each step and adjustment purposeful, reinforcing the quiet assertion of his presence and authority. Adler observed, noting the patience, precision, and deliberate ease in every gesture, the way authority could be conveyed without haste or volume, with calm clarity and composed attention. The soft, ambient sounds of the compound, the muted clatter of tools, the distant murmur of voices, the faint shuffle of feet across wooden walkways, formed a gentle backdrop to the concentrated interaction unfolding between them, emphasizing the subtle rhythm of observation, understanding, and recognition. Adler exhaled slowly, controlled, letting the dry, cool air fill his lungs as he absorbed the lesson in composed authority, the recognition dawning that leadership could exist through deliberate observation, measured action, and patient composure. Hayes's eyes remained fixed, following Adler's small movements, the slight shift of weight, the tilt of the head, the careful adjustment of gloves, absorbing each microexpression, reinforcing the silent understanding that command and respect were communicated through presence and intention rather than words. Dust continued its slow drift through the deepening twilight, catching what remained of the sun's light and accentuating the space between the two men, framing the quiet dialogue of authority, respect, and human composure. Adler adjusted his stance, shoulders easing further, hands resting lightly, acknowledging that true command could be expressed through calm, deliberate presence, patient observation, and fairness. The shadows lengthened and deepened, stretching over barracks, fences, and the yard itself, highlighting the textures of earth, wood, and fabric, emphasizing the measured interplay of authority and understanding. Hayes allowed the moment to linger, presence steady and gaze unwavering, reinforcing the silent balance that had settled between them. Adler's eyes met Hayes's with a subtle, almost imperceptible nod, a quiet acknowledgement of the lesson learned, the equilibrium reached, and the recognition of authority without aggression. The compound, alive with subdued activity, soft ambient sounds, and drifting dust, framed this exchange, underscoring the power of deliberate action, patient observation, and composed presence. Twilight deepened, enveloping the yard in cool, muted blues and indigos, and the final traces of warm light highlighted the edges of the barracks and the figures themselves, leaving an impression of calm authority, respect, and the enduring quiet strength of measured, human composure, a moment where understanding and recognition were conveyed entirely through presence, poise, and deliberate attention. Night had fully descended over the compound, the sky a deep navy sprinkled with early stars, and the last vestiges of sunlight had vanished behind the distant hills, leaving the yard bathed in a gentle, cool indigo glow. Captain Robert Hayes stood at the center of the yard, posture firm yet composed, each breath measured and deliberate, his eyes surveying the barracks, the fences, and the soft, scattered movements of prisoners completing their final tasks for the day. General Klaus Adler lingered nearby, shoulders squared but relaxed, hands lightly resting at his sides, eyes following Hayes with a quiet focus and growing recognition of the calm authority the captain maintained without speech or gesture. The air carried the faint chill of evening, mixed with the lingering warmth of the earth and the subtle scent of sage drifting from the hills, while a gentle breeze stirred, lifting dust motes into slow, meandering spirals that caught the dim light of the stars and the lanterns along the walkways. Hayes shifted his weight slightly, a minimal, deliberate motion that reinforced his presence and authority, each step precise, deliberate, and unhurried. Adler observed, noting the quiet patience, the exactness, and the controlled ease in every gesture, realizing that command could be expressed entirely through presence, observation, and composure. The compound maintained its subdued rhythm, the soft shuffle of boots, the occasional murmur of conversation, and the faint, distant clatter of equipment forming a gentle, ambient backdrop to the intricate, silent interaction between the two men. Adler inhaled slowly, letting the cool, dry air fill his lungs, grounding his thoughts, and allowing him to absorb the lesson in deliberate authority and the balance of power conveyed through calm, composed action. Hayes's gaze remained fixed, tracking subtle movements, micro-expressions, and the controlled shifts of stance that communicated command without sound. The drifting dust caught the faint lantern light, emphasizing the space between them and framing the silent exchange of recognition, respect, and measured authority. Adler adjusted his stance again, shoulders easing further, acknowledging internally that true leadership could exist through patient observation, quiet presence, and fair consideration rather than through loud assertion. The shadows lengthened across the barracks, fences, and open yard, the textures of wood, earth, and fabric illuminated in soft contrasts that lent a cinematic quality to the scene, reinforcing the deliberate interplay of authority, acknowledgement, and human composure. Hayes allowed the stillness to stretch, presence unwavering, letting the subtle ambient sounds, the scrape of boots, the soft clatter of tools, the faint murmur of conversation, frame the lesson in calm, deliberate leadership. Adler's eyes met Hayes's in quiet reflection, a subtle nod forming, the acknowledgement of the equilibrium and the silent understanding that authority and respect could coexist, communicated entirely through composure, observation, and deliberate action. The compound, alive with subdued activity, drifting dust, and soft ambient sounds, framed this final exchange, reinforcing the enduring impact of measured presence and human dignity. Twilight deepened fully into night, the stars twinkling overhead, casting a soft, reflective glow across the yard, and in that gentle darkness, the moment settled as a lasting testament to calm authority, respect, and the quiet power inherent in patient, deliberate leadership, where presence alone defined hierarchy and human recognition, leaving an indelible impression on all who observed.